this is one of the most interesting things that I had read, given where I was at in my journey, I guess, and with the knowledge I had and the preconceived notions I had. When I stumbled across so many years back your history and theory of periodization article, which addressed specifically periodization, the Soviet model, addressed a lot of things that were maybe very relevant to Soviet lifting success that kind of ran against what most people parrot as far as like, well, the Russians did blah, blah, blah. They were amazing. And this is why they were amazing, and on and on and on. And in all of this talking about program structure and cycles and how long blocks are and on and on, these are the things that make everybody's head spin. But this was the first thing I came across in an era where everything is based off this like primary assumption of like the supremacy of the Soviet system and of how important periodization is. It seemed to really challenge that and suggest that maybe it's not as important as people think. Can you summarize that a little bit?
Most of the, I'd say, like theoretical underpinnings of periodization come from Soviet sports scientists, and their work was very influential, and I think very I think it came across as inherently quite credible. It was being put out in a period of time like during the Cold War. Like they started developing a lot of this stuff in like the late 50s, early 60s. But it kind of like started reaching the US in like the 70s and 80s, around the time that like we had kind of built up the Soviet Union into like the big evil empire. Like we're ideologically opposed to them, and the Olympics were functionally just another front in the Cold War. And the idea was like, if we win more medals than them, that proves the superiority of the American capitalist system. But if they win more medals than us, like, oh no, what does that say about us? Like, yeah, whatever. So like there was a lot of just like societal and cultural angst built up around this. And I mean, like the Soviets were really good at winning Olympic medals, and people kind of wanted an explanation why. And and they certainly didn't want to say like, ooh, well, maybe communism is good for sports, which like it's an economic system. Why would it be good for sports? Like that's completely different domain. But people didn't want to say that. But I mean, like there was, I think, the best explanation for why the Soviets were so good at winning Olympic medals did probably have a lot to do with how their society was ordered, and the fact that they had like a very top-down social system, and filtering athletes into different sports was more about like, you would have like the USSR would do early talent identification programs, filter people into sports academies. You didn't have too much say over what sport you did. It was more like they would figure out what sport you had aptitude for, and like you were going to do it for the glory of Mother Russia, whether you wanted to or not. And so like they did a very good job of just like matching people with like physiological proclivities for particular sports with the sports they do well in. Whereas like in the US system, like there's none of that, like people play the sports they want. And like sometimes those are the sports they're good at, sometimes it's not. And oftentimes it's not Olympic sports, like how many Olympians are playing in the NFL right now? You know what I mean? And so I don't think people in America really wanted to introspect and think too hard about that and say like, ooh, well, maybe it would actually be good for us, like not across the board, certainly not for society in general, but like if we want to beat the Soviets at the Olympics, maybe it would be good if we had like fewer personal freedoms and more of like a top-down talent identification approach. No one wanted to have that conversation during the Cold War. And so an appeal to Soviet sports science and the periodization stuff they were pointing out was like a very convenient non-ideological explanation for why they were so good. And so there was a lot of lore built up around that. But when you actually like dig into when you actually dig into like the success that can be attributed to periodization per se, I don't know, it's not much. Like if memory serves, like 1956 was the last Olympics before like Russian sport started really really going in on like periodization for like all of its athletes and all of its Olympic sports. And when you compare like how many medals the USSR won relative to like the total medals there were to win in 56 versus the two subsequent games like 1960 and 1964, it didn't really seem like their performance improved that much. So like, you know, they were already winning a lot of medals and they just kept winning a lot of medals pre and post periodization. Another factor is just like the science that people make recourse to from like the Soviet era, like to back up the power of periodization was like essentially survey research. It's not the type of stuff that I think most people would put a ton of stock in today. So essentially, after it was either the 52 or 56 games, I can't remember which, but after one of those two, essentially they just sent out a survey to all of the coaches who had coached Olympic athletes who had won medals and just said like, hey, how did the training for this athlete look for the last 4 years? And they just kind of said like, well, here's what we've been doing. And then they made the classic philosophical blunder of deriving alt from is, and they said, well, if that was good enough for these guys to win medals, what if we just like systematized this and assumed that that is the ideal way to train athletes? Boom, now we have periodization. Which, you know, that's certainly not the worst way. Like the thing is, like, those people did win medals, so that doesn't tell you that the way they were training was the best way to train, but it does tell you that it was at least good enough for them to win medals. So, you know, but that's not like the most rigorous approach of finding ideal training methods. And then finally, the types of sport. The type of sport is really relevant here, because just on like a purely theoretical basis, like you should expect periodized approaches to be more necessary for some sports than others, just like largely dependent on how many different properties the athlete needs to be good at, and like needs to be elite at. So if you compare powerlifting to a sport like soccer, like the biggest sport in the world, to be good at soccer, you need to be strong enough that, you know, people can't like jostle you for position when going for the ball too much. You certainly need enough like lower body strength to develop enough power to sprint fast, to get to the ball, to jump high, to get headers. And independent of that, you do just need to be fast. You need to be fast enough. You need lateral quickness. You also need to be in really fucking good shape so you can run a lot, like a really good aerobic base. And very importantly, you need to be a skillful athlete. Like you need to be fucking good at soccer. And all of those things compete with each other. You know, like if you're doing too much aerobic work, that's going to take away from how much strength and power and speed work you can do. If you're doing too much of any of those things and you're always fatigued when you're working on like actual soccer skills, that's going to detract from skill development, and mastery of the actual like technical elements of the sport. And so, you know, you can't do all of those things really hard all the time. Like there are just too many conflicts. And so like periodization does kind of give you a framework that you can start to kind of like organize those things. Like, hey, like how are we going to screen athlete needs and decide like what we're going to work on more? I guess that's not really that much periodization. But, you know, if someone does need to like get stronger and also improve their aerobic conditioning and also get faster, like how are we going to sequence those things so that we're not training super hard for all of them all the time? How are we going to be able to like manage training around the actual competitive calendar? Like, when are we pushing it hard? When are we pulling back so people can recover? Like all of those things, a lot of considerations. Compare that to a sport like powerlifting, where like you need to be good at three things, which I don't want to say there's no motor skill required to be good at squat, bench, deadlift. Like there certainly is. But if you just compare the most technically proficient powerlifter to what Messi can do on the soccer pitch, there are orders of magnitude difference of like the sheer like motor skill required to do that. So like the skill component, it's there, but it's not the same, you know. Aerobic conditioning needs, like, yeah, you need to be in good enough shape that you don't have to recover for like 15 minutes between sets. But like you don't have to be in as good of shape as a soccer player. Like speed, power output, that's not that important. Like you can grind a lift, like it's just force output. So I mean, like you need to build muscle. You need to be relatively good at three like relatively simple lifts. And like you need to be lean enough to like make your weight class. Like that's it. Like it's a much simpler sport. So there are just like fewer competing needs that you need to like organize and plan training around. Because like for the most part, I mean, if you're trying to build a muscular base for powerlifting, it's like, hey, what muscles need to be really big so they can produce a lot of force? Well, probably pecs, probably triceps, probably front delts for bench press. Okay, like what exercises can we do to build those muscles?
In bench
Well,
press.
bench press, you know? And guess what? So, you know, it's your hypertrophy training and it's your sport practice, and it doubles up. So yeah, there's it's just a much simpler sport. There are fewer like things you need to like organize around. So the inherent need for at least like really really gnarly and hairy periodization models, like I just don't see quite as much need for it.
Yeah, and that was the point that I was going to make. And then you covered it beautifully. It's such a unique feature in sport to have the thing that you're preparing for also be the thing that is your primary driver of development. It's like, you know, talk about two birds with one stone. Whereas like what you said, over the entire developmental season for a particular sport, if all you do is play the game, you're going to be pretty sorry come game day. That you're just infinitely better if you break things up. But now you have this complexity that has to be arranged. So given everything that went into, let's say, Olympic glory, right? You have state sponsored recruitment programs, you get the best of the best, state sponsored drug programs. You have the psychological and like social aspect of, this is my job, this is how I get out of poverty, this is how I bring glory to my nation, and so on. All of these things, they seem to take so much precedent over like some arbitrary arrangement of training stress, especially given all of the different types of periodization or training that have given rise to gold medalists. Doesn't seem like there's one approach that works. So, I mean, would you say, because we think of periodization in our weightlifting centric brain, because this is all we think about all day, we associate it with a lifting mechanic. Do you think that the role of periodization and fixating on different phases of training, it's just overstated, it's just largely unnecessary for most lifters that you come across?
Yeah, yes and no. Like I think there are I think that it can be useful from like a practical standpoint from time to time. And I think it probably depends on like what level a lifter is at. But I think for most lifters, probably don't need to worry about it too much most of the time. So like if like a good example is just kind of like splitting apart hypertrophy phases and strength phases. Um, like I don't think, you know, I don't think that like the classic approach of like, hey, we're going to do 12 weeks of hypertrophy work, and then we're going to like drop the volume quite a bit, like ramp the loads way up, and really focus on strength for another 8 to 12 weeks. Like, I don't really think you need to do that. for the most part. I think that for most lifters, um, as long as you keep heavy enough work in your hypertrophy blocks, like as long as you're touching 80-85% or so, with some regularity, like the skills necessary to lift a 1 rep max they're still going to be there, and if anything, like keep improving. So you can maybe do like 1-2 heavy-ish sets, and then just like more volume work, or throw in more accessory work to build the musculature. um and so then like you can develop like strength and muscularity simultaneously, and then maybe you do have like a 4-6 week peaking block where it's like, okay, like we are going to drop the volume down, like get really heavy for a few weeks to make sure you're ready for the platform. But yeah, I don't think most lifters need those really bright lines between training phases. I do think that it's useful from time to time, if nothing else, just to like reorient people's mindsets, like especially for people who are um that they have the type of like psychological disposition where they just want to run themselves into the ground all the time. Like their training is their priority, and they're like 1,000% training all the time. um just just practically kind of like splitting things apart, like, hey, like this is your competitive season now, you got a meet coming up, like now is when to really hammer it. But then after the meet, okay, we're gonna have a 3 month off season. So get that in your head, reorient your mind. You've really like put yourself through the meat grinder for the last 4 months to hit this big total. And now like you need to give yourself permission to kind of like step back and not do that for a little bit, so you can recover, and not just like run your body into the ground. I think that can be useful, on a more like psychological level than physiological level. But yeah, like I just don't think that the marginal benefits of periodization are as large for powerlifting as they are for like almost any other sport.